Alexandra Deschamps-Sonsino. And she's an author, a consultant, a public speaker, an entrepreneur, designer. She wrote many books. She wrote Smarter Homes, How Technology Will Change Your Home Life 2 years ago. But, you know, she works all the time. And she now has a new book, Creating a Culture of Innovation. Most people know her for a variety of other things. She ran the Internet of Things meetup in London for 8 years, which is a really big community. She helped the community to create better IoT, a free checklist to help founders and product managers for more ethical decisions. She was the founder of the Good Night Lamp, which is a sort of a, you know, moment in IoT, like, okay, this can work, and how does it work? It's now in the London Design Museum as a key example of the Internet of Things. Co-founded Think in London. I know it's a lot. I'm almost there. The first UK distributor of Arduino. And recently, she's about to turn 40, and she said there's no such thing as internet, as fame for designers. Now, we all disagree because we all think she's super famous in this field. So, Alexandra, you are going to talk to us about one specific chapter in your book about innovation. Can you switch on your video and audio and join us?
Thanks. Thanks, Monique, for having me. Thanks, everyone, for being here. There's a lot of familiar faces. And yes, it would have been so much nicer had we not been in a pandemic, but this will definitely do. Props to Iskander, Andrea, Peter, the whole team. I know also Dries is somewhere out there in Senegal. So yeah, this is definitely a little family affair. And this specific Ask Me Anything also feels like a family affair. What I thought I would share with you are a couple of thoughts from my new book. So it's so new, I don't even have a copy, but you probably have a copy or might have a copy. It's called Creating a Culture of Innovation. This was the copy I made myself so that I could do corrections. And so God knows it's probably, it's not this format, and it probably doesn't look like this at all anymore. The world of publishing is super funny. I will one day write about that. And I thought I would pick up some thoughts which are in chapter 4. What's this book about, and what did I want to write about after all these years working in physical products, working for clients as a consultant? The whole book was kind of triggered by, I think, an accumulation of walking into spaces that describe themselves as innovation spaces. And me kind of looking around going, interesting. In that kind of super British way of saying interesting, which is, you know, with a raised eyebrow and some concern in my voice when I say it. And this chapter, it's the last chapter of the book. It's called Showing Off. And it's a chapter about the ways in which corporate environments feel like they have to display their innovation work. What I think the connection to this community is very tangibly in what I think has been a really interesting co-opting of makers and the maker community. So I moved to the UK in 2007, and I started out by being the first UK distributor of the Arduino at a time in 2007 when, you know, yes, maybe a handful of hundreds of people knew about it in Europe, but it was very early on. And now we've kind of gone the other side, which is, you know, most people probably know about Raspberry Pi, even if they don't know what it does, but they kind of know the brand. And so these tools have gotten common enough that they're associated with a particular thing. And I think the interpretation of that in corporate culture and in innovation cultures in corporations has been to make and invest in spaces that feel like the kind of spaces where those kinds of tools are used. What that might generally mean or might generally translate into are spaces that are kitted out with the right kinds of tools, but the work might not be done in those spaces, but they are publicly accessible. Sometimes you might need a little tour around them. But they're sort of these weird dedicated spaces to invention for corporate environments where the invention doesn't even happen in that space, but it's sort of a space that's been created to prove that that kind of work is possible inside that corporation. So there's a few different things I talk about in this chapter, but one of these things where I'll kind of break down, I guess, the kinds of types of innovation spaces that do this. One which I talk about is the barely visible innovation space, is a space that utilizes the terminology of invention, but again, doesn't actually display the inventiveness itself. So people who might use, and I name names, which, you know, is super uncomfortable because maybe I'll never, as they say, I'll never find work in this town again. But corporations that will attach themselves to a word like garage or lab or any other terminology that actually has nothing to do with what they do, but they're sort of latching onto a physicalized idea of invention. A makerspace is, you know, another one of those. And when you look around and you go into that actual space, all you see is basically an office with desks. But there's been an attachment of this concept where this is a garage. And with that association, what they're trying to reach into is the world of HP, the HP garage, the Apple garage, whether or not Jeff Bezos has a garage he did anything in is not really the conversation here. But the idea that something happens in a small place that's domesticized and that's associated with not having very much and doing what you can in the space that is available to you or disposable to you, which is a garage. That association is so strong in people's ideas of invention and success that they'll apply it to spaces that have nothing to do with that. So I find that interesting because when someone says, you know, this is our corporate garage, I'm kind of looking for the garage, but I don't see it. And I also am interested in this use of garage because people use their garage because, in a way, you know, you've made it when you've managed to be able to afford to not be in the garage, to not be working from the garage. So if your corporate garage is a really nice, comfortable space, then is there as much sort of pressure for you to get out of that space and to actually move up or be successful or show that your project has legs, etc. So I find that super interesting because it's sort of the use of space without the space actually being there. Another one which I talk about is I was super trying to be sweet about it. But you know, the self-congratulatory nature of some innovation spaces are spaces that are there because it would be rude to call them flagship spaces. And so these spaces are, you know, very cool, very urban. They tend to be in the city centers. They tend to be accessible. They're associated with corporations that, you know, do what you and I would call knowledge work. So they're consulting spaces, they're management consulting spaces, but they felt the need to have a physicalized space that they call an innovation space, which is, you know, either a restaurant or a you know, space for gaming or whatever it might be. But it's something that's kind of got a cool edge to it because it's urbanized and it's sort of set up in the city. It's visible from the street. You can walk into it. And that's a type of space that's been created. And I also find that interesting because it's, again, in any other context, we would call that a flagship store, you know, sneaker brands or large corporates have had flagship stores and we're kind of comfortable with the retail concept, but this is that concept taken and shoved into the innovation bucket. And I also find that super interesting. And then there's the innovation space as museum experience. So a space that actually is much more of a museum showcase. It might showcase the history of the company. It might showcase the latest product. It might showcase some, you know, very limited edition products, but it's of an innovation space, but you can't access it publicly. You probably need someone to give you a tour. In one instance, I was sat down to be given a sort of VR, AR experiment that, was, I had to sit in a particular spot, and I had to, the lights were dimmed, and everything becomes kind of theatricality. And again, the stuff that I would experience normally in a science museum. And that, I think, is also really interesting, is the need to sort of show people something, and show people something using what are described as leading edgy tools within a space that, gives me a certain impression of what the business is capable of, but doesn't get me any closer to seeing the actual work. And then there's everything under the sun, especially I think in the big fours, which are innovation spaces that are really demonstration spaces, and they're much more education spaces that lead the people who visit those spaces to understand the latest technology. It has nothing to do with what that business does. It has something to do with what the rest of the universe may or may not be talking about. But they're a comfortable environment for an external client to come into that business and go, show me what's new. And that is also described in the words of the corporation. It's described as, this is our innovation space, but it's just not their innovation. It's someone else's innovation that is being displayed in that space, demoed in that space. That space sometimes is used for training. It's really about this sort of translation of worlds, which that corporation uses that space for. But again, it's described as an innovation space. So, we can put under that bucket sort of incubators and accelerators that are corporate in nature. Again, if you look at them and you squint, you just see an office, but obviously something else is happening there. But I wanted to sort of stop for a few seconds, and then I'll stop on the idea of makerspaces. Because of course, it's also been a really interesting part of our collective experience to contribute and to grow the maker community, the IoT community, a community of people talking about good practice, associated with the physicalization of ideas, the physicalization of products, eventually commercialization of those products, from experiments into commercial success, into, in some cases, acquisitions and mass success. All of that particular journey, I think, has been very appetizing to people who don't necessarily come from an engineering background, don't come from an invention background, but have space. And major corporations have a lot of space. So in some instances, you'll find that people will have dedicated some physical space in their office to an internal makerspace. And what they really mean is, more often than not, what I've seen at least, is a physical space with a 3D printer in the corner. And the 3D printer has become kind of a totemic image of what makes that space special from the rest of the office in their particular building. And I find this super interesting, because I think that you skip through a lot of steps in doing this. You sort of take on the image of innovation, the image of invention, without knowing actually what's necessary and needed. So in bits of this chapter, I sort of go into some of the more recent research in the UK around makerspaces, which literally someone produced a report to say, these are criteria which you might consider if you're going to invest in an internal makerspace. These are some of the criteria you might consider in order to ascertain whether that was a good idea or not. And so because the tools themselves are so cheap for, not to you and me as necessarily makers and designers, but to a corporate environment and to a corporate budget, buying the latest and greatest Ultimakers or MakerBots or whatever, that's not really a concern or a barrier. But then making that space live, and making that space relevant for the corporation, making that space even do anything, and for things to actually be produced that are taken on, is 12 steps later. And the 12 steps later are not usually the concern of the person who's just kitting out the space. And so one of the things that I think we have to be wary of is the cultural co-opting that we have helped create. So, you know, if in the future you walk into a corporate makerspace, you know, really sort of ask them, like, what have you done with this space? What have you physically been able to do? What has your team been able to learn? Does 90% of your staff actually know how to use any of these tools? You know, who's there to support it all day long? Or is it just a sort of outsourcing function to your design team, or an outsourcing function to your strategy team who just want a gizmo once in a while to show their client to say, this is how smart we are and look at our beautiful space? So I'll stop here because, you know, this is a whole book which sort of ties in a whole bunch of elements, but those are some of the things that I thought I wanted to share with you today. Again, there's loads more. I also go into a lot of detail around lots of different elements of innovation, but yeah, creating a culture of innovation. And if you're not interested in buying the book, which I totally get it, because especially in the UK, people read 4 books a year. So if I am lucky enough to make it into that list, that's terrific. If I'm not, I'm tweeting short videos of some of the books that I really like that helped me write my book for all of the Advent calendar. So I'm up to, I'll be up to number 11 by the end of this morning. That's it.
Thank you so much. I think buying a book and reading a book are 2 completely different things. And I'm speaking from the world of still buying books as if I would read them.
I as an author, very, I would say, selfishly, I don't care if you read it or not. I care if you buy it or not.
Exactly. Ladies and gentlemen, the link is in the chat. Order it right now. You can have it before everybody else does. I would like to open this up to the audience, and to make it easier for you guys, I'll ask 1 question, but then it's up to you. So indicate in the chat if you want to ask a question on audio or video. Some people have logged in with just only to listen. They cannot switch on audio and video to ask a question in person. In that case, just put it in the chat. The other people, let's hear from you. Now, you just described how lots of these maker spaces are basically more marketing. It's like showing off clients, like who we are, you know, creators, and we are. What do the real innovation spaces look like? Are they basically looking like people behind the computer? That's it, right? I mean, this is our world. We are people behind computers. So they basically don't look very interesting, even though the most interesting work is being done there.
Yeah, completely. And I think I think our tendency, I think it's a post-industrial thing. Like, you are so desperate to have a connection to an ancestral view of engineering and invention, where someone is surrounded by, I mean, you know, the vaccine work that's being done and the press around the vaccine work is, you know, super interesting, because we've been fed for the last 8 months imagery of vaccine research that most people probably had never seen in their life. Like, I'm pretty sure the average Joe had no idea what a science lab actually looks like, which is just like a fucking endless ream of things labeled very clearly, and a million different kind of ways of processing that information. Someone with goggles and just a lot of care, and quite close to their colleague, because they're in these like tiny corridors of super hyperventilated spaces. And that imagery wasn't particularly common. I think most people have been fed the imagery of a sort of industrial or Victorian industrial imagery through sci-fi films or through steampunk kind of imagery. And I think that that's what we latch onto when we're trying to artificially create a space that feels like invention happens here. Because yes, you're absolutely right. Most people will do terrific work on the same tool as someone who's checking Facebook all day. And there's no compelling way of showing this unless, you know, and this is also why I absolutely adore Post-its for that reason, because they're all the
It will be
in.
It will be interesting to see. No, it will be interesting to see how the new innovation spaces will have to be created online because working from home and being distributed all over the world is standard these days. So
yeah, not necessarily leading to the most like the best work you can do, especially if you're a parent and you're homeschooling at the same time. Like, you're probably not going to have your great ideas then. And I think a lot of people will suffer from the pandemic in terms of having the space to contribute positively to their businesses.
Joanna, switch audio and video. We'd love to hear your question. Can you do that?
Okay, I can use the microphone.
Perfect.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Good question.
Hey, Alex, thank you so much for this talk. It's as always really interesting to hear your reflections. And I have a question about the kind of spaces that are the opposite, because a lot of these spaces that you talked about, they seem to promote doing and making. And although I think this is really important for design, we're thinking I was thinking that also in spaces like that, like a garage or a lab, people break things, and this is normally something we do to try to understand something better, especially now talking about AI and obscure technologies. We need a lot of that, a lot of breaking and trying to understand them. So I was thinking, what are the spaces where designers can stop doing and think and reflect, and also where are spaces that we could break things and disrupt and rethink?
I mean, I think it's an interesting question about the psychology of breaking, which is you have to be prepared for your team to break things. You have to be prepared for risks to be taken. I'm currently working with a client where people couldn't be more risk averse for really good reason. Someone who shall remain nameless, a public organization was in the process of moving all of their services to Google hosted services, and the whole thing broke halfway. And as a public institution, they've been struggling to get that back online for months now. And so how comfortable people are with risk, with breaking things, is not something that you can tangibly, I don't think you can tangibly represent, apart from saying, we're going to host you in a completely different building, and it's not even on the corporate Wi-Fi, and off you go. I don't care what happens there. You've got carte blanche. And some people have done that in some ways, and other people have decided to keep things actually quite close to the family, because otherwise the risk with isolating the group of people who can break things is to say to the rest of the business, well, you can't break things, and only they can break things. And that's also uncomfortable. And so how that culture kind of is permeated across the whole business is a question of leadership. It's a question of politics. It's a question of like communication. None of this has to do necessarily with the job of design or the job of designers. It's how that work is framed by the rest of the organization. And I think that's also a really big challenge and really interesting.
Thank you. Peter, you have a question as well. Switch your mic on or your video if you want.
Sure. Video always takes an extra couple of clicks, but there you go. Yeah. Hey, sorry, I haven't had a chance to read the book. It's still in the mail. But I
think it'll be in the mail for the next 7 years, considering it's all because of COVID delays. So yeah.
Fair enough. So based on your experience, or like on the things you reached, do you have a personal favorite of like some, a setting where the space really contributed a whole lot? Like something that worked really well, or would you say it really depends on the context and not so much on the space? Like where do you fall? But also just like, do you have any examples in mind where you say, yes, this was fantastic?
I mean, I have to be careful not to be too nostalgic about the wrong things when I wrote this book. And I think there's some really interesting lessons to be learned about the past. And so my favorites tend to be kind of old stuff that doesn't really apply anymore. So one of, I'm looking around because I'm surrounded by books, you've no idea. One of my favorites is actually, or one of my favorite kind of corporate contexts that I think was successful for a very long time is Olivetti. So I studied in Ivrea, as some of you might know, which was the home of Olivetti, the typewriter manufacturer. And what they did was really clever, just socially really clever. And I think they created both psychological space as well as physical space that enabled people to do their best work. So their workers who were in the beginning predominantly male and had families, everybody would get trained up just in terms of literacy. So they would get classes at whenever they wanted. They would get training up in their own personal finance. The managing director for a long time would meet with employees to help them budget. And when they felt that the government wasn't supporting families enough or healthcare enough, they actually offered the families of the employees support. They then went on to create creches for the employees and just a whole load of things that we still struggle with. And this was, 100 years ago, literally. And I think that they were, and I make that point in my book, which is they offering a canteen, which I think is our first go-to, let's make people happy. That was the last thing they did. It's almost the last thing they did. Because they sort of recognized that people like to go have lunch at home and wanted that bit of their day to be a bit of a personal break. And so they just offered everything else around it, which we in 2020 absolutely struggle to do. And I think it's reflected in the turnover in major corporations. I mean, all major corporations, in big tech, turnover of staff is crazy. I mean, we're talking about people who can't retain their staff for more than 2 years. Whereas in Olivetti, people stayed not exactly for life, but for a really, really long time. And I think that would, that would please more people now. But that attitude of making people feel that they're recognized and their needs as people and as family members and as parents and, just people with other kinds of needs other than corporate needs of productivity are recognized. I think that's still super laudable. And I really like that.
Yeah, there's an interview that was done with Jonathan Ive when he was still at Apple. They asked why his design team, because he designed everything, was so successful. And he said, it's because we have had the same people for 15 years. It's the same team. And because it's the same team, they trust each other. And because they trust each other, they can make mistakes and break things and recover and so forth. We have more questions, which is very good. Andrea, you go. Are you there? Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
Hi, Alex.
Hey.
Thank you for being here. So my question is a little bit more in the direction of innovation spaces for universities. So it's not always the same people. They change from year to year. And so my question was, so should the innovation spaces as spaces be as familiar and convenient as possible so that people would like to stay there and share a part of their life in there apart from the study? Or should it be as strange and inconvenient as possible so that you are forced to think differently, so to think outside of the box?
I mean, I think it's super interesting because I think that, an innovation space for a transient community is really tricky. So one of the books I really like, which classic, but it's called Managing the Flow of Technology by Thomas Allen. He talked about the fact that the people who made the best kind of initiators of new ideas, because they helped connect the outside world to the inside world, tended to be people who had been around for 7+ years. And so if that is the function, let's say, perhaps of the professor, firstly, you have to make sure that they've been there for like that long, that they also have built up that whole network. I know that's sometimes the case, might not be. So you're dealing with like transients on like 2-3 levels. And so I think that ultimately it's down to the familiarity that is breeded by the fact that people are with each other more. How much more and how much you can force them to be with each other currently, I won't even get into, but in normal times, whatever that means, I think that it's really, I look back to my master's degree years, and we just did a lot of drinking, you know, and that helped a lot. It helped a lot because it bred that low-level competitiveness that meant that everybody's projects, like we were kind of looking at other people's work and going like, oh, that's really good. Oh, and that because we were also friends, so we weren't just competing just for the sake of competing, we were also friends. That really, I think, elevated the level of ideas that we had. But making sure that people had a chance to socialize with each other continuously, I think, was the big job that was done by the staff, was making sure that people didn't end up in small groups that never mixed with anybody. We were always working with each other across the whole group. And we were just 17 people. But I think even doing that with a corporate department today is still really hard. So doing that in academia is even harder, I think. And doing that with in academia in 2020, when half of your brain could be taken up by conversations you're having with strangers halfway across the world, or your family halfway across the world, or your friends in the other building, is also super disruptive to the idea that you're there and you have to build a connection to this person in front of you.
Okay, so my takeaway is drinking helps.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you could say that about some things, not everything. Everything in moderation, everyone. But yeah.
When you're young,
Okay.
especially as well.
Oh, that's a pity. I'm out now. Okay, thank you very much, Alex.
That's funny. When you mentioned creative spaces, I very long time ago, I was in art school and I was in a specific building, and that building was excellent because it was 3 floors, but all the floors looked into the same big hall. So wherever you were, you could always see everybody else walking around. And of course, all the workspaces were shared. So you had to see what everybody else was working on. So that's definitely one. Oh, who else has questions? It doesn't have to be about creative spaces. You can ask her anything. That's what's so exciting about this concept. When it comes to the creative spaces you described, I hope you took pictures of all of them, because it would be a wonderful slide deck of innovation spaces as we saw them in the last 10 years.
So I think it's been really interesting to be a little bit uncomfortable about what I'm writing, because it's definitely capturing a moment in time that I think is rapidly disappearing. I think people are starting to come off that bandwagon because of AI. And so AI has forced, I think, people to admit that some of the theatricality that they were trying to create is no longer viable. I think 2020 will have stretched people's, I think, expectation of what they can do with their office space as well. And I think that what I wrote about is capturing something that I've seen over 10 years that might very swiftly disappear, but I think was architectural typology I wanted to capture, because I think it captured a particular time, a particular kind of anxiety, a particular kind of corporate anxiety. Yeah, I think we're rapidly going to go down the other end, I think, which is people dumping their innovation function or people subcontracting it elsewhere and not really, and ever again taking it internally.
Okay. There's a question. Why do you write books? Andrea just asked it, so I'll just relay it here. Why do you write books?
Why do I write books?
Yes.
I think I write the books that I can't find, if that makes sense. I'm a big, I've always read a lot. I've never understood people who read on ebook format. I'm glad you're buying mine. Buy my book on ebook because it's available now. But I also decided, I had in the back of my mind for 20 years that I wanted to write. And so it comes in parallel to the other kind of work that I do, and the work that sometimes is tangible, but sometimes, massively intangible. The meetup itself, for example, is a completely intangible piece of work that took 8 years. It's intangible because, it's putting people together in a room and for 2 hours every month, but it's not, it's nothing there. And I like the tangibility of putting ideas down and then referring back to it. I find myself like going through Smarter Homes all the time, going, what was that thing that I said? And what was that thing that I thought? And I find that really great because, if I thought I was writing books that had already been written, I wouldn't bother. But because there are ideas in my mind as a designer, but also as someone who I think, can do bits of writing, I thought, well, I think this is a process I'm going to learn from. I think it's a process that I really enjoy. And until I have nothing more to say, I will keep trying to find publishers to publish them. And
keep writing. We have a few minutes left, and suddenly 3 comments, questions. So
it's always like this.
Yeah. Don't worry. We'll eat a little bit into our break. Gerrit, what would you like to ask?
Hi, Alexandra. I was just thinking, I wanted to ask a question not directly related to the book. And I came across your work on the Low Carbon Design Institute yesterday, and I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about that.
For sure. Talk about like the next 10 years kind of thing. So I've done a lot of my career decision-making is done in chunks of 10 years. And I'm turning 40 in a couple of weeks. And I had definitely gotten to the point where the last almost 3 years of my work have been centered around climate change in one way, shape, or another. And I thought it would be quite interesting to examine also an old desire of mine from the last 20 years, which is to start an academic institution. So writing books and starting a school were things that you could have asked me when I was 25, and I would have identified them as things I wanted to do. And so the Low Carbon Design Institute is a first step into doing that. Whether it ever becomes a physical building that you can point to, I don't know yet, but in the meantime, for 2021, it's a 2-week retreat for creative people who are interested in knowing more about climate change, because some of the research and some of the work I've done have exposed a whole bunch of really interesting dynamics that I think the average creative designer, web developer has very little understanding of. And I think that literacy is required. I think that we ought to, as a community, be much more informed and much more able to then have new ideas on the basis of a changing landscape, and a landscape that currently exists in other areas, whether that's policymaking, whether that's engineering, whether that's, economics even. These are areas that I've gotten to work with and are very unusual for a designer. And so I wanted to make those accessible. So the program is a 2-week program. That's a free program that you can apply for. And I am looking for sponsors for that particular program. So if you have deep pockets and an interest in supporting creative people in their understanding of climate change, talk to me.
Exactly. Talk to. Let me see. One more question then. Needy, can you switch on your mic and ask a question, or switch on your mic and video if you like? Needy, if you're there, would you like to ask your question? Hello. Yes. Go ahead. Yeah, please do. Oh, no microphone. Okay, I'll read out your question. How do you create these reflective, creative innovation spaces in the virtual world? Is that something you have insights on? And adding to that, I must say that I've been organizing conferences for the last 25 years, all gone. Nothing. Everything is gone. But I always felt, especially in these early years of the internet and the explosion of new ideas and new services, that these seminars, events, conferences also serve as creative spaces. I mean, that's where a lot of the exchange is taking place. Now, we're moving all that online. How are we going to do that?
So I think the best way to think of yourself right now is being in a cloister. A cloister is, if you don't know the expression, is an architectural typology that monks used to have, which is you had your little cell where you would write, you would reflect, you might pray. And then you had the courtyard that you stepped outside into, where everybody else you may or may not bump into, but if you kind of needed a break, you knew where to go. And I think we have to think of our world as living like that right now, because it's too easy to focus on the courtyard and to go, I must have Zooms with everyone under the sun, otherwise I will go mad. When in fact, taking advantage of the fact that you might, I say might, be able to organize your time in completely different ways, and to earmark when quiet time happens and when social time happens, and then to really be careful about organizing social time in a way that makes or deepens particular relationships with particular people. You don't need a call with 25 people for it to be a valid call. You can have a call every week at 4 p.m. with one of your mates, just to kind of breed this habitual nature of your time, and for your thoughts to be also constructed around those times, to know that, oh, Professor X, who I'm having a call with, or my colleague blah, who I'm having a call with every week, I should leave that thing for that call. I'm not going to like go on Slack immediately and go, oh my God, I have a thought, blah, blah, blah. Like, keep it, just keep it aside, put it on a Post-it, and just keep it. And so treating your cell and treating the courtyard as if you were literally in the 15th century or whenever that was, I think is an interesting way to segregate it. I myself have done almost no social Zooms whatsoever. I see a very limited number of people, but I see them in very particular ways. On weekends, I do exactly no work. I go on long bike rides. And so I've ended up being militarized about my work in such a way that allowed me to write a book this year. This year.
It's very long year, yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much.